Right, well, good evening again. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Friends of Belsize Community Library. For those who don't know it, Belsize Library was founded in 1897. It moved to its present Grade 2 listed building in 1937 and had been a council-run library until 2012, when the council relinquished 3 of its libraries. And since then it's been run by the Winch, which is a local charity which looks after disadvantaged children in various ways. The Friends of the Library for many years have put on monthly literary events, and of which this is one. And normally they had been held actually within the library, but since the COVID pandemic started, obviously we haven't been able to do that. The events are held to popularize the library and also to raise small amounts of money by way of donations, which are normally made for people who are attending in person. Now, this particular event, like all our online events, is free, but the library does depend on grants and donations in order to survive. And so if anybody feels so inclined, donations to the library are gratefully received. There is a link for people to do that, which is in the flyer that you will have seen, and subsequently to the talk, I'll put it in the chat. And you can copy it, and if you'd like to make a donation, that would be very well received. Now, to introduce our speaker, Laura Spinney, who we're most grateful to welcome from Paris. This is one of the advantages of online meetings, is that it's somewhat easier to get people at some distance to come to the library. Normally we have people in the vicinity. I'm just going to ask at this point if everybody who isn't already muted could mute themselves, because we get extraneous voices coming in and that can be a bit disruptive. I think, David, if you could mute yourself, that would be helpful.
You mean me?
Yes, please.
I think so.
Well, how do we do it? Camilla's trying to help me out.
Right.
I can't find myself.
I'm still admitting some people, so right. I think that's probably
there. I am.
Right.
I'll mute there, surely.
You're not muted, I'm afraid. If you find yourself unable to mute, then do please try to keep as quiet as you possibly can while the talk's going on. Anyway, so we're delighted that we've been able to get Laura over from Paris, where she's been living for a number of years. Laura graduated in natural sciences from Durham University in 1993, and then became a science journalist and an author and broadcaster. And in fact, in 2019, she spent 2 months as a journalist in residence at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She's written, among other periodicals, for Nature, the National Geographic, the Atlantic, the Economist, the New Scientist, and the Guardian. I'm sure there's some others that I've missed out. She's the author of 2 novels, The Doctor, which was published in 2001, and The Quick, published in 2007. And more recently, she's produced a collection of oral history from a Central European city entitled Rue Centrale. However, the reason that she's come tonight is that she's the author of a book that was published very presciently in 2017, Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World, which is an account of the 1918 flu pandemic. And since the onset of the COVID pandemic, her writing has been very much in demand, and I think she's had 2 articles in The Guardian in the last week alone, if I recall correctly. Her book is a comprehensive account which draws on a wide range of sources across the natural sciences, social sciences and humanities. And in a moment, I'll ask Laura to start speaking on the topic, which is pandemics old and new, parallels between the Spanish flu of 1918 and COVID-19. As I mentioned before, and some of you will have heard, the talk is being recorded, which is an extra reason for trying to keep deathly quiet while it's going on. After the talk, I will ask Laura a few questions just to get the ball rolling, and then invite questions from the audience. Please, could you put your questions in the chat, which one of our other committee members is helping me to keep an eye on. So I hope we won't miss anybody and we'll get in as many as we possibly can. But do keep your microphones on mute, just to remind you again throughout the talk. So Laura, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Anthony, for the very kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to now try and share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see a rather wistful looking man there. Can you? Good. Okay. So this is Nirala, whose name means something like the strange one. He was a poet, now considered one of the most important figures in modern Hindi literature. And he was 22 years old in 1918 when a new and dangerous infection erupted in his native India. So I should let him take up the story. The following lines come from his memoirs. The newspapers had informed us about the ravages of the epidemic, he wrote later. I traveled to the riverbank in Dalmau and waited. The Ganga was swollen with dead bodies. At my in-laws' house, I learned that my wife had passed away. Other members of his family died too, and there wasn't enough wood to cremate the corpses. Nirala wrote, "This was the strangest time of my life. My entire family disappeared in the blink of an eye. All our sharecroppers and laborers died, the 4 who worked for my cousin as well as the 2 who worked for me. My cousin's eldest son was 15 years old, my young daughter a year old. In whichever direction I turned, I saw darkness." So I kind of like to start with Nirala because I think that when we talk about the so-called Spanish flu, we tend to get lost in the numbers. So I think it's important to start with the humanity of it and the human scale of the loss. And he expresses it so very well. But now I'm going to throw some facts at you. So this basically shows the major catastrophes of the 20th century. And as you can see, here is World War II. It's estimated to have killed, the figures vary, but somewhere around 50 to 60, maybe even more million people. First World War, around 17 million people. The Spanish flu, we think now, killed between 50 and 100 million people. It's thought to have infected 1 in 3 people on Earth. That's 500 million people at the time. And the number of people it killed of the global population at that time was about 2.5 to 5% of that global population. So it was the worst catastrophe of the 20th century, far worse than the First World War in terms of sheer loss of life, on a par perhaps with the Second World War, and possibly worse than both put together. And yet we forgot it, but I'll come back to that. It struck in 3 waves. The first wave in the Northern Hemisphere, spring of 1918, was relatively mild, not that different from a seasonal flu. The second wave, which erupted in the latter part of August 1918, was by far the worst. And there was a third wave in the early months of 1919 that was intermediate in severity between the other 2. The number of waves and the dates of the waves varied depending on where you were in the world. So we tend to say that the 1918 flu was over in about 2 years. But if you were in the Pacific Islands, for example, it was still raging in July of 1921. So it was something that was very much staggered across the globe and that tended to strike the Southern Hemisphere later than the Northern Hemisphere. And just to give you an idea, though it was spread over those 2 to 3 years, the vast majority of those 50 to 100 million deaths occurred in the blink of an eye. They occurred in 13 weeks between the middle of September and the middle of December 1918. So for those living through it, it must have felt incredibly intense and incredibly rapid. This map, I should first of all say, is not accurate, but I just wanted to show it because it's actually very difficult to find a map that kind of gives you a sense of the global spread. So ignore the dates at the bottom, but it does at least show you that it kind of spanned the world. And maybe you can see from the crazy mess of arrows that it's also quite difficult to say what direction it took, where it started, and how it proceeded. But the important thing to take away from this is really that very few parts of the world were spared from the 1918 pandemic. There were exceptions: Antarctica, because there were no human beings; St. Helena's in the island in the Southern Atlantic, famous for being the place of exile of Napoleon, was spared because it's remote. There was another island at the mouth of the Amazon called Marajo, which was spared, and the continent of Australia, because it put in place good public health measures. That might sound familiar to us again today. But essentially, the entire world was affected by this pandemic. And to give you an idea, though, we don't know, so in terms of the burden of death, probably the epicenter of this pandemic was India. We think that India, the estimates today are that India lost around 18 million people. So that's roughly the equivalent of the casualties of the First World War in one country alone. It's not the highest death rate of any country, but it's the highest number of deaths in absolute terms of any country because of the sheer size of the Indian population. So in some ways you can think of India as the epicenter of that pandemic, though its story is barely begun to be told. It was no ordinary flu. This was a particularly vicious flu. I mentioned that the first wave resembled a seasonal flu, but when it came back in the autumn, that wave that was responsible for the vast majority of death, that second wave, it was sufficiently different that people thought they were dealing with a different disease. Once again, as with any flu, the vast majority of people recovered, but the minority who went on to develop very severe forms of the disease, that is, they found themselves in respiratory distress, they started turning blue in the face, they often bled from their noses and mouths, horrible symptoms. Sometimes they even just dropped down, not necessarily dead, but unconscious and then quickly dead in the street. That minority was very much bigger than in a normal flu season or even any other flu pandemic. It was probably 25 times bigger than that minority who suffered severe or lethal forms of the disease in any other flu pandemic. So it was a very particularly vicious flu, that one. There was no test, no reliable test. That's the reason why our numbers are so vague. When we say between 50 and 100 million deaths, you'd be forgiven for saying, well, that's a very wide spectrum of estimates. And there's a good reason for that, which is that flu is caused by a virus. Virus was a relatively new concept in 1918. The first viruses had only been identified at the tail end of the 19th century. And most doctors in the world thought they were dealing with a bacterial disease. There was no treatment, no effective treatment for this disease, no vaccines, no antiviral drugs. Those didn't come into the clinic until the 1960s, and no antibiotics either. Now, you'll say to me that antibiotics don't work with a viral disease, and of course you're right, but the vast majority of those people who died of the Spanish flu, as with COVID, it turns out, actually died in many cases of bacterial pneumonia, that is secondary complications, opportunistic bacteria infecting the lesions in their lungs, which were created by the virus in the first place. I think I probably don't need to tell this audience this, but it wasn't Spanish. There was nothing Spanish about that flu. It acquired that name because, of course, the First World War was raging when this pandemic erupted in the early months of 1918. And the countries that were at war censored their press. So supposedly in order not to lower the morale of the population. So countries like the USA, the UK, France, Germany kept it out of their newspapers, even though they had it before Spain, whereas Spain, which was neutral in the war, when it had its first cases in Madrid in May of 1918, they were immediately reported in the newspapers, and they included the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, who went on to recover, but he had a bad case, and so he lent it some visibility. And not only all Spaniards, but people much further afield assumed that it was rolling out from Madrid, hence the name. And names, as we know, tend to be sticky. And the belligerent governments of the world, it suited them to have a scapegoat. So they encouraged this naming of the Spanish flu, and the name unfortunately has stuck. Given the number of people who died in that pandemic, it must be among one of the worst historical injustices in the annals. So about the only thing that we can be certain about that pandemic is that it wasn't Spain, because it wasn't Spanish. We know there were cases in other countries before there were cases in Spain, but we still can't say today in 2021 where it did start. There are three leading theories on the table, and the actual truth could be not among those three. They correspond to origins in the United States of America, in Kansas, close to the military Camp Funston, where the first official cases were recorded in early March of 1918. The second theory corresponds to a possible origin in the interior of China. And the third theory corresponds to an origin in northern France at a place called Étaples, just south of Boulogne on the Channel coast, in a British army camp. As I speak today, we cannot choose between those two theories. We don't have sufficient evidence, but we may be able to one day. There's a lot of research going on in this area, which has probably been accelerated and fueled by COVID. People are interested to understand that pandemic because of this pandemic. And it's not impossible that we will find samples in some hospital basement somewhere that could shed light on the actual origin of that pandemic. It would require finding samples that were still in good condition, hadn't been contaminated or degraded in any way, and that came with the clinical records that described what the patient from whom the sample was taken suffered as a disease. But if those things come together and exist, then in theory we should be able to compare the sequence of the genome of the virus in those samples with samples taken from the pandemic proper, and look at their relationship and see where the precursors of the pandemic virus came from. So we could still work out where this pandemic started. It's not impossible. So the flu had an uneven impact across space. I told you that almost no place on Earth was spared, but the impact it had in each place was very variable. So for example, if you were in certain parts of Asia, you were up to 30 times more likely to die than if you were in certain parts of Europe. And the reasons for that are complicated. They probably have to do with genetic background, to do with climate, to do with culture, to do with festivals that brought people together, but mainly we think with socioeconomic inequality. So again, the same things that are at work today with COVID-19. But not only was it uneven, and also you see variability not only between continents, but also between countries, also within countries. Cities tended to be harder hit than rural areas for reasons mainly of density of habitation. But even within cities, you saw variability. So poorer areas were affected worse than richer areas. Immigrant areas were affected worse than non-immigrant areas. In France, in Paris, where I live, 1 in 4 women who died of the flu in 1918 were maids. And there was one oddity that statisticians had great trouble explaining for a long time, that one of the highest death rates in Paris was in one of the richest quartiers, the 7th arrondissement, until they worked out that the people dying there were not the wealthy homeowners on the noble floor, as it's called, the étage noble, noble of the house money and apartment buildings, but the maids who were in the chambre de bonne at the top and who lived in unheated rooms and worked all hours that God sent and were often badly nourished and badly paid into the bargain. So there was great variability across space, but there was also great variability across time as well. And what I mean by that is that there was great variability across age groups. Also across sexes, by the way, men were marginally more vulnerable than women, although pregnant women were particularly vulnerable to that flu. Normally, a flu, whether it's seasonal or pandemic, tends to strike the very young and the very old. This flu, its mortality curve was not U-shaped like that with the high ends at the young and old ends. It was W-shaped because there was also a middle age group that was very vulnerable, and that was the 20 to 40-year-olds. And that, it's taken me a long time to get there, is the reason why I'm showing this painting, which is, I'm sure many of you will recognize Egon Schiele's painting known as The Family. It was actually originally called The Squatting Couple, but it shows him and his wife, Edith, who died of the Spanish flu in the autumn of 1918. She was 6 months pregnant with their first child. He died a few days later. And so this is a family that basically never existed, never came to exist. For me, it kind of distills the entire tragedy of that pandemic, because it took out the producers in society, it took out the parents, it took out the people of working age, and it took out the people who supported the communities at a time when there was no real social welfare net. So with them gone, many widows and widowers went into workhouses, and many children orphaned just sort of vanished really between the cracks. It's one of the great mysteries of that pandemic, what happened to the orphans. We know there must have been millions of them. Some of them would have been taken in by extended family, others as wards of state. Of course, it depended on where you were in the world. Many would have gone into service or labor on the fields, and others just became vagrants. We don't really know, there's no statistics on those orphans. There are anecdotes. We get glimpses into their lives from letters written and diaries kept. But it's one of the great untold stories of the 1918 pandemic, what happened to the orphans. These patterns that I'm describing, which were shaped by the same forces we're seeing at work today with COVID, age, comorbidities, sex to some extent, ethnic background, socioeconomic inequality, they were not visible at the time. People then, of course, it was a time when infectious diseases were still the biggest killers of humanity. Life expectancy was much lower, even in the wealthy countries. Illiteracy was much higher, and it was not so much further than, you know, the great discoveries of Darwin. It wasn't so much later than germ theory and understanding about hygiene and Florence Nightingale. It was a time when it was much easier to believe in mystical explanations of disease. And you have to remember also that in many parts of the world, people had been worn down by 4 years of war. They were psychologically, if not physically, exhausted. And it was very much, it was first of all, it seemed like a random lottery. Why was this village decimated while the next one was spared? Why was this family decimated while the next one was spared? It seemed random to them, and they searched for explanations. They had no treatments, no obvious treatments. The medics seemed to be helpless in the face of this disease. And so it was easy for people to fall back on the idea that it was a punishment for the war, it was punishment for other sins, that it was somehow fate, and there was nothing you could do about it apart from pray. So you saw people crowding into their churches and mosques and synagogues, and performing rituals that we might now consider archaic or even blasphemous, depending on where you come from. But I think human beings, when they're afraid, will try anything, and that was pretty much all they had to try at that time. So, as I mentioned, the pandemic was basically over by, depending on where you were in the world, March 1920 to July 1921. But it had some very long-term consequences, as you might imagine, for a pandemic that killed between 2.5 and 5% of the global population. This is a picture taken in Dillingham in Alaska in probably the summer of 1919, because the worst wave to strike Alaska was what was the third wave everywhere else. It was spared from the 1918, the main second wave everywhere else, because it was iced in, basically. The Bering Sea is frozen over in winter, then it melts in the early months, and then the first fishing boats came in the spring of 1919, and they brought the flu with them up from the United States. And it devastated the populations of Yupik Eskimos in the region of Bristol Bay, where Dillingham is located. It's a sort of inlet of the Bering Sea. Devastated villages, whole villages were wiped out. Bristol Bay lost 40% of its indigenous population. And this is a picture of some of the orphans that were rounded up from around the bay after the pandemic had receded. That gentleman is Dr. Linus Hiram French, who ran the government hospital in Dillingham and basically managed the epidemic locally. Once they had rounded up all those orphans from around the bay, probably took them well into the latter part of 1919 to do that. We think they had close to 300 of them. Dillingham at that time was a town of fewer than 200 inhabitants. So those orphans, as they grew up, tended to stay in or around Dillingham, and every single inhabitant of Dillingham today claims to be inherited from those orphans. So I'm telling you that story just to give you an idea of the kind of demographic impact of that pandemic. In Dillingham, at least, it was a complete turnover of humanity. One of the interesting things about the 1920s is that many parts of the world saw a baby boom. This has often been put down to the war. The idea is that the men came back from the front and there was a new wave of conceptions, and there you go. But it doesn't explain why there were also baby booms in countries that were not involved in the war. For example, Norway saw a baby boom in the early 1920s. It had been neutral, so the men had not gone away to war, but they had been affected by the flu. And the thinking now is that though it's impossible to disentangle the contributions of the war and the pandemic to that baby boom, they both contributed. The thinking now is that the pandemic also played its part by the following mechanism. It essentially rid the world of people who were already fragilisés, I'm again trying to say in French, who were already weakened by other underlying, often infectious diseases, for example, tuberculosis. It rid the world of a lot of people with tuberculosis and left behind a smaller but healthier population that was able to reproduce at higher rates. So that's one of the ideas behind how humanity in general adapts and recovers and regenerates itself at the population level to such catastrophes as pandemics. It doesn't take away from the fact, of course, that there was huge amount of individual loss and misery, but human populations have this extraordinary capacity to regenerate. Of course, the impact was not just demographic. Such a gigantic loss affected pretty much every domain of life. There are historians, pretty much all historians agree that the pandemic accelerated the end of the war because there were such terrible losses on both sides. There is a more minority controversial view that it also affected who won the war. The thinking is that the Germans and Austrians, the Central Powers, may have had the flu in their countries for longer. There's evidence from the archives that they had it earlier and for longer. They were also hungrier because of the naval blockade on Germany and various other factors. And when you're hungry, when you're starved, your immune system is compromised. So they may have been hit harder, but that is a theory that is out there. It's not necessarily embraced by the majority of historians. It definitely affected the peace, though. If you think about the peace conference that went on in Paris in the early months of 1919, it was badly affected by the third wave when that struck. So many of the delegates at that peace conference came down with the flu. Probably the most significant victim of the flu in that wave was Woodrow Wilson, the American president, who, as I'm sure you know, was critical in those negotiations because he was really the only moderate negotiator of weight. He was desperately trying to balance out the more vengeful positions of his European counterparts. He wanted reparations laid at Germany's door and the Austrians' door to be not as heavy as the European leaders wanted. He came down with flu in the early months of 1919, as did his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House. We know that Woodrow Wilson had already had neurological problems by that point in his life. And though retrospective diagnosis is a very tricky affair, a lot of attention has been focused on Woodrow Wilson's case that spring. And there's an idea amongst neurologists that he may have been suffering mini strokes triggered by the flu. Observers noted that he changed character. He became less willing to listen, less patient, less accommodating. People said he was ready to snap. And so they noticed his changing character. It's difficult to say how much the flu contributed to that, but most neurologists agree, who've thought about it, agree that it probably did contribute to the massive stroke that Woodrow Wilson experienced that autumn when he was back in America, which left him paralyzed down one side and basically took him out of politics and prevented him from being able to persuade Congress to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and to join the League of Nations. So in that sense, through the figure of Woodrow Wilson, you could argue that the Spanish flu cast a very long geopolitical shadow. It also had, the pandemic also had an impact on medicine, on healthcare, in the sense that socialized medical systems of healthcare that were free at the point of delivery and paid by some other mechanism, by taxes, by national insurance, had been discussed before the pandemic, but nothing had been done about it. From the 1920s on, you see these systems being put in place. It was a massive effort that was required because you had to reorganize the way that healthcare was delivered. You had to rethink the way it was paid for. Previously, it had been mainly private or charitable foundations which had delivered healthcare. Afterwards, you see the first socialized systems coming in. The first was Russia. It wasn't universal to start with. To begin with, it was only urban dwellers, but by the 60s, rural people were also included. Of course, our NHS in the UK came to be in 1946, but the foundations of it were already being built from the 1920s. The United States was a different route, but tried also to bring in, in a sense, the intention was the same, which was to broaden the base of healthcare, bring in more people. There was an understanding that if you were to confront a pandemic like this again in the future, you needed to, first of all, have eyes on the health of your entire population. And you also had to raise the baseline level of health of the poorest and the least, and the people who had least access. Because, as we often hear said these days, nobody is safe until anybody is safe in the context of a massively contagious disease. So there was that new impetus for socialized medicine. There was also a new impetus for a global organization that would coordinate a response amongst countries to such a global catastrophe at that level. And so you see the forerunners of the World Health Organization coming to place. The League of Nations, when it was created in the wake of the First World War, had its own health branch. And there were various other international organizations which gave birth eventually to the World Health Organization in 1946. And I also argued in my book, although this is much more tentative, nobody has really properly done any research into this, and it would admittedly be hard to do, that it had an impact on art in the 1920s. So one of the extraordinary things about the 1918 pandemic is that it was relatively ignored by artists. If you think about the four major upcoming writers in the United States at that time, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, and William Carlos Williams, all of them were affected directly or indirectly by the 1918 flu, which they lived through as young men. John Dos Passos was a soldier who crossed from the US to Europe on one of the transports, the great enormous ships that transported troops and that were lethal spreaders of the disease, because Woodrow Wilson, prior obviously to catching the disease himself, insisted that the war take priority and the transports continue, despite that his doctors were warning him of the terrible price they would pay for that. William Carlos Williams was a doctor in New Jersey. He was making up to 60 calls a day in the height of the pandemic, but never mentioned it in his poetry. So there's this huge sort of absence in artistic memory of that event. And I try to explore that in my book. I think the first thing to say is it's very difficult to penetrate the minds and the souls of people of a different generation. But at that time, first of all, people didn't have any idea of the scale of the disaster, even those who had lived through it. The first estimates of the death toll of the Spanish flu that came out in the 1920s put it at about 20 million deaths, so roughly on a par with the First World War. And it was only at the end of the 20th century that those numbers were raised, that new estimates put it at between 50 and 100, and people had this kind of beginning of a glimmer of understanding that it was a far greater catastrophe. And I think by then, in a way, it was too late. It had already been overshadowed by the First World War in the telling of history. That brings me to the issue of memory. All across Europe, so France, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, had a frenzied monument building to the First World War. There are an estimated 170,000 monuments to the First World War across France. I don't know a single monument to the Spanish flu in France. This is one that I found in the Jura Mountains. It's actually on the Swiss side of the French-Swiss border. And as you can see, if you read French, it's to the soldiers who died of the flu that autumn. So I think this is a really interesting monument, because even when there was memory of the flu, it was sort of polluted by the war memory. So I think that the lack of data is one of the problems there. Also the language issue, the fact that people didn't know what had hit them. They didn't know it was a virus. They had not the language to describe the phenomenon. They also were exhausted, as I've already said, by the war. They had this other great tragedy in their consciousness. And I think underpinning all of these reasons why that flu was forgotten is a storytelling issue, which is that we as human beings, we tell stories in a linear fashion. That's the way we do it. Our stories have beginnings and middles and ends. They take dramatic turns at points, but they unfold over time, and they have heroes and villains. And a pandemic doesn't fit that nice narrative structure. The 1918 pandemic, as I mentioned, the vast majority of the death occurred in 13 weeks between the middle of September and the middle of December 1918. It was this enormous blast of death. It was everywhere all at once, and then it was gone. So that doesn't fit, a linear narrative. And there were heroes. There were heroes who were doctors and nurses and carers and so on. But the villain was a faceless virus. It wasn't an evil human villain that you could, become morally outraged about. And I think all of these reasons, all of these factors help to explain why not only that pandemic, but pandemics in general tend to be forgotten quickly. And that has consequences, actually, because, there have been an estimated 15 pandemics in the last 500 years. They're not that uncommon. If you work that out, they don't happen at regular intervals, but it works out at on average 3 pandemics a century. We've already had 2 this century. There could be more. It's not that unusual an occurrence, and we always act as if surprised by it, but we shouldn't be. We don't invest enough in in preparedness. We don't invest enough in developing the vaccines that we should to be ready for the pandemic when it erupts. This is my last picture, really. He's gone now, thank goodness. But this is, for me, the poster child of that forgetting, because in many ways, Donald Trump, a very wealthy man, at least on paper, owes his vast wealth to the Spanish flu, since his grandfather, Friedrich Trump, who was a German immigrant to the US, died in New York in that pandemic. And he left a small sum of money to his widow and son. His widow invested it in real estate. So the rest, as you could say, is history. But under Trump, pandemic preparedness suffered terribly. He cut funding from research into coronaviruses. He dismantled response systems and prevention programs at both the national and international levels. He withdrew from the WHO, of course. Joe Biden has taken us back in. But here is someone who forgot the horror that impacted his own family and left the world less prepared than it could have been as a result. So I think for me, I'm not a historian, but I did write a history of the Spanish flu. There is a reason for understanding history in its own right, and there is a reason for understanding history to prepare ourselves for the future. That's what we need to bear in mind, I think, as we write the history of COVID-19 going forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. That's a fascinating introduction to this really complex subject. I wonder if I will start by asking you a few questions, and then I'm sure people will have a lot of questions to ask, and particularly in relation to similarities and differences between that pandemic and the current one. But just as a bit of sort of background, as it were, about you really, before we get into the detail, I wonder if you could say what it was that led you to become a science writer, having taken your degree in natural sciences. I mean, I don't know to what extent that's a major option for people who do sciences, whether you had in mind that you would use it in a different sort of sense, or quite when that happened. Could you tell us a bit about that?
So in my case, I always knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to write. I went to journalism school after I studied natural sciences. And after that, I went and worked for Vogue for a little while. And I also worked for a newspaper in London that operated on the narrowest shoestring you've ever seen, called the Catholic Herald. I'm not Catholic and I'm not religious, but the Catholic Herald was an interesting newspaper because it was the only Catholic newspaper that was independent of the church in the UK at that time. And it was edited by a brilliant woman called Christina Rodoni, who was my mentor for a while. Anyway, I loved those experiences, but ultimately I came to the decision that passion and religion were kind of cyclical subjects, and the same stories did the rounds. And I decided at some point that I would write about science because it was eternally renewing, always new stories that were always, you would never get bored. So I decided to write about science. I don't know if you're interested in why I wrote this book, because that's quite a fun story.
My follow-up question.
I had actually mentioned about infectious diseases before I wrote this book, and the story is that I was living in Switzerland in 2013. And at that point, lots of the editors who I work for, because I'm freelance as a science journalist, were saying to me, we need to start thinking about how to mark the centenary of the Great War, the First World War. And since we're science journalists, we were thinking about science angles. And one of the things we were quite excited about was battlefield archaeology, which is a big field now. And since I was living in Switzerland, I said, well, look, I know about these archaeologists who are working up on the frontier between Italy and Austria, which was the third front in the First World War. There were battles fought up there at 3,000 meters altitude for the frontier between Italy and Austria. And so guys up there, they essentially invented high altitude warfare. They had special skis, they had funiculars for taking up their material. They had what now seems very primitive, but they had equipment and clothing and uniforms that was to protect them for frostbite. And when it all was over, all of this material, including their own remains, just sort of fell back into the snow. And ice is a great preserver, so the ice preserved all these remains. But now the glaciers are melting, and so all this material is melting out of the ice, and these archaeologists were trying to catch it as quickly as they could in order to conserve it, in order to reconstruct what happened on that front. So I went up with them in the helicopter, and I wrote about this story. And while I was there, they organized the funeral of two Austrian boys, 17, 18 years old, who had melted out of the ice, almost perfectly preserved, their blonde hair still attached, their uniforms still on, their soup spoons down the side of their gaiters. And they had not been able to identify these boys because there were no living relatives to whom they could compare the DNA. So they held their funeral in a little mountain church on a summer's day in 2013. The churchyard was full to overflowing. People were flowing down the mountains. Italian families, Austrian families from either side of the border who understood that these could have been their grandparents, but who were lost in battle. It was one of the most moving things I've ever attended. It must have been the last, if not one of the last funerals of the First World War. And I came home and I said to my husband, well, I hope there's not much more of this going forward, because I'm not sure I can take 4 years of marking the centenary of the First World War, emotionally, I mean. And he thought for a minute and he said to me, you know, I think that the Spanish flu killed many more people. I'm not sure, you should look it up. So I did my first Google Spanish flu death toll, and I came across the figures I've been telling you about, 50 to 100 million dead, which is just far outshadows out of the First World War. And I was like, why aren't we marking that centenary? I mean, nobody was talking about it. So it's just this completely forgotten catastrophe. So it seemed to me that then somebody needed to tell the story. And that's how the book got born.
Right. I mean, you take a very sort of synoptic and, as I said, multidisciplinary approach to the subject in your book. Do you think that differs from the way in which other authors have written about it? I think you also say in your book, I mean, they're really a rather small number of books written about the Spanish flu altogether. It's not minute, obviously, but compared with the First World War, that it's a tiny number. But have other people taken a rather different approach from yours? I mean, it did seem
the
amount of information that you brought in from different fields.
You know, I think history is written by a kind of snowball effect. I mean, so when I started on my book, the few books that had been written for a popular audience on the Spanish flu were very American-centric, occasionally Europe-centric, but nothing had been written about what happened in China or Russia or India, and those places bore the brunt of it in terms of death. So something was wrong. I mean, the story needed to be retold in a global sense. And the other thing that happened is that, I'm talking about the snowball, that as the 20th century advanced and people understood it had killed many more people than they had originally thought, then many more disciplines started getting interested in it. So originally it was just medics, actuaries for insurance companies, medical historians. It was a very narrow group of people who were interested in it. But as people realized that it was this huge catastrophe, perhaps the worst of the 20th century, if not of many centuries, you've got other people getting interested in it, economists, mainstream historians, military historians, because who wanted to understand how it impacted the war, psychologists, anthropologists, all sorts of different people brought their interest, their curiosity, and also their expertise into understanding it. And so what you understand quite quickly when you start looking into this is that it's a sort of whole of society story. I mean, I think we understand that quite well today. It's almost like I don't need to explain it now that we're in the thick of COVID. You know, it's such a multi-dimensional, every aspect of our lives is affected, and every aspect of our societies impacts the flu and how the COVID and how it rolls out. So it's a thing that can keep expanding. And, you know, I talked about the impact on the arts earlier. This is something that in the context of 1918 there's been almost no research done on it. Why did artists ignore it? What impact did it have on the arts, if anything? I laid out some hypotheses in my book but really much more research is needed. What impact will COVID have on the arts, if any? These are all questions where the history and the present, I think, interact with each other and inform each other in a really interesting way.
Just as a practical point, how did you go about doing the research and how long did it take?
So the whole thing took me about 3 years, but I was also working to earn my living at that time because nobody wanted this book. Nobody wanted it until it was written. So I was funding myself. And the trouble is when you're researching a global phenomenon like that, you have quite a lot of expenses, because if you can just imagine the languages that the archives were in that I needed to consult, I needed a lot of translation help for a start. And so I basically spent a lot of time trying to charm people to volunteer their services for me in various countries, and to you know, go into the archives for me and help them find me what I needed. And you know, I had to make some practical decisions as well. I mean, so if you've read the book, you'll see that it basically zooms in on it paints a global picture, but it also zooms in a lot of detail in about 9 places. And I had to make a selection. There's no way I could have been any more comprehensive than that. And I tried to get geographical, cultural, climate, diversity in that selection. And also I tried to go to places where I knew the archives were sufficiently rich that they could actually tell a story. And in those places, I needed to get people to help me. I speak 2 languages, English and French. So I needed people to help me with all the others. So it was quite a logistic operation apart from anything else.
Right. Okay, I just wanted to pick up on a point you were talking about the way memories develop about pandemics. And I think I picked up a very nice phrase from your book, which is that, you know, these take a long time to develop. They have to be woven into the fabric of common memory, I think you said. And I wondered if you thought that this remains as true today as it did then, given we're talking 100 years ago, and since then we've had globalization, expansion of modern forms of communication. Do you think that now the whole process of developing memory about this will be speeded up, or would you expect it to be similar?
I mean, so
talking about COVID, of course.
So I mean, there is a narrative amongst people, historians and people who are experts in what is now an actual field called memory studies, that pandemics are remembered differently from wars. And the idea is that the 2 phenomena impact society in different ways. Wars destroy infrastructure and human beings, and pandemics do not really destroy infrastructure, they just destroy human beings. So the idea is that we recover more quickly from pandemics. Of course, 1918 is a special case because you have both. But one of the ideas is that because you recover more quickly from a pandemic, you forget it more quickly. And therefore you go through these cycles of panic and complacency. Panic when the new one comes along because you weren't expecting it. Complacency once it's over, and then there's a lack of learning. Also feeding into that, I think, is the fact that it's very much harder to document a pandemic. If you think about it, even today, we know there's a massive underreporting problem in the world with COVID. It's worse in poorer countries where health infrastructure is fragile, but in all our countries, protecting people who don't come to hospital, who have COVID, who may die at home with COVID. We know there's this large category of people who fall into that, and therefore they're not being seen in the statistics. So just establishing the scale of the thing is much more problematic than for a war. But what's interesting about COVID is that, so this forgetting is something that we see with pandemics throughout history. But there's a discussion going on in memory studies now about whether this may actually be different. This may break the trend in the sense that this is the first major pandemic that's been digitally witnessed. So it's the first one where you know, we've had the internet really. We had the internet in 2009 with H1N1 flu pandemic, but that was sort of an anti-climax as a pandemic. It didn't kill many more than a bad seasonal flu. This is much worse. And think about it, the last year, if you wanted to, if you were so inclined, you were able to watch infection rates and death rates almost in real time. I mean, we have an enormous amount of data about this, and we've been able to track it all over the last year. And all of that data is being conserved. Of course, there's a lot of fake info in there as well, but that's always been a problem with pandemics. So we have a much better record of this one, and we've had it already. You know, it's been started at the beginning, and you know, we have vast amounts of data about it already. So there's a debate. Will this be different? Will this be better remembered as a result? And we'll have to wait and see. But that's one theory.
Right. Yes, I was also thinking about the fact that writers who are experiencing either personally or just being generally aware of the pandemic are already starting to write about it, which might be a contrast with the American writers that you spoke about, who'd suffered the effects and yet barely related to it in their work, if at all. So that possibly is different. I'm just going to ask one final question, and then if the audience could start thinking of your questions and putting them into the Q&A while you're dealing with this one. And it's really about the impact of pandemics on world affairs. It might go a bit wider than maybe the Spanish flu pandemic, but there seems to be a sort of thought that there's a sudden and dramatic sort of change in world affairs in various aspects brought about by, you know, catastrophe of this sort. And you've alluded to some of them, like the impact on healthcare services and so on. And I was thinking about perhaps some of the historical examples, and to what extent some of them are really rather more speculative and fanciful, given so much else that was going on at the time. So you talked about Woodrow Wilson and the possible impact on the Versailles Treaty, and that maybe some people have speculated that this also, you know, affected the Second World War in the long run. But and maybe, I mean, you know, there may be a story there. I think there are other stories in your book I wasn't quite so sure about, like I think Sverdlov, had he not died, Stalin might not have come to power. Is there anything behind that? And could you talk about one or two of these other examples, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, well, so Sverdlov was the first secretary he was the person who actually was charged with building the communist state from scratch after the Russian revolutions. And he died very suddenly of the flu. And then there was a succession of, I think there were general secretaries, weren't there? I can't remember the exact title, who replaced him. None of them were up to the task until Stalin turned into the road. I mean, this is counterfactual history, so you know we can never say what would have happened otherwise. But you know, he died. So you know, if he had not died, would Stalin have come along? We can never say. It's slightly fanciful, of course it is. But I mean, so take for example, you know, I think. What I was trying to show overall is that the pandemic can often exacerbate trends that are already in place, already started in place in a certain place. So for example, there were already huge racial tensions in South Africa, but there wasn't apartheid yet. And then in the 1920s, you see action taken on laws that had been discussed previously about, for example, segregating towns and cities along color lines. And it's not me saying this, I'm quoting South African historians who say that the Spanish flu fed that because blacks were blaming whites and whites were blaming blacks for bringing this disease in. So it kind of fueled those racial tensions. Or you could look at India, where a different thing happened. So Gandhi had just come back to India from South Africa just before the pandemic erupted. He was being seen in sort of elite circles, elite independence circles, as a future leader of the movement and of the nation, but he didn't have any grassroots support. And what you see happening is the pandemic erupts in India. It has an immediate and terrible impact. And the British colonial government is absolutely incapable of confronting it. Not only has it never put any resources into indigenous healthcare in India, thinking it's a hopeless problem, but even the doctors there are in India are away at the front. So it puts out a call for help, and the people who step into the breach are the sort of local caste and community organizations who are in touch with local communities, and they set up flu relief organizations, and it's very difficult to say if those flu relief organizations actually brought any relief for the flu, because we're administering things like Ayurveda medicine and vaccines made out of God knows what, but nothing very effective. But what it did do was that it mobilized them, it brought people together across castes, and it brought them into contact with all kinds of different sub-communities, different religions, different castes, untouchables, and it created this kind of network that was being funded to a certain extent by the national independence movement. And so you see all these people sort of coming in behind Gandhi. They're all pro-independence movement. And when he calls for them to come out on general strike in 1921, they do. So what I try to describe with the evidence at my disposal in my book is that the flu was a great kind of mobilizing event for many disparate grassroots organizations in India and brought them in behind Gandhi. So that's another example of a geopolitical impact.
Right. I mean, one wonders, of course, what people might say in the future about COVID, and we won't sort of go into detail about that at the moment. It might come up in the questions, you know, whether it will be seen in the future that great changes have taken place as a result of that. The only thing that occurred to me immediately, of course, was in relation to the last picture that you showed. Here was a man, Donald Trump, who had come into his fortune because of Spanish flu and was probably brought down by COVID. It's probably the most dramatic example that one can think of at the moment. There's some questions coming up in the chat, so we'll have a look at some of these. From Pat, who says, COVID has produced anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories. Were there similar things going on in relation to Spanish flu?
Yeah, so basically anti-vax or vaccine hesitancy or whatever you want to call it, because it is a whole spectrum from people who are, you know, extremely opposed to people who just have doubts and questions. That is as old as vaccines itself. But it does tend to get exacerbated or brought to the fore in a pandemic. I guess that's not surprising. And the thing is that in 1918, many vaccines were manufactured, often in government labs and given official stamps and so on, and there were official vaccination campaigns rolled out. But given that nobody realized it was a viral disease, they were antibacterial vaccines. They tended to be made against opportunistic bacteria that were, you know, infecting the respiratory tracts of people who are already infected by flu. So it was all very confusing because very occasionally they had an effect because they were having an effect against those secondary infections, but for the most part they were ineffective, and people gradually saw that, and there was a great debate and disagreement and uncertainty in the scientific community, all on the record, just as we're seeing today. In America, for example, the American Medical Association said, don't touch these vaccines, whatever you do, which you might argue is not a great public health message, but of course, in hindsight, we know they were right. There were huge debates as today as to whether disinfection helps, whether masks help, who do they help, when, in what conditions, exactly the same debate. There was even a debate over the use of quinine, which is related to chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, the same debate we're having today. In some ways, it's spooky how the same debates have come back. But I suppose the common thread is that the scientific process, with all its debate and disagreements and arguments, and sometimes, you know, even personal arguments, is all on display for everybody to see how it's working. And that has its good and its bad sides.
Just to expand a bit on the conspiracy theories, not only in relation to anti-vax, but in relation to ideas about who or what might have been behind this. And we know there are all sorts of spurious theories. Could you say something about who was held to blame for the Spanish flu?
Yeah, I mean, there was the usual extremely broad and colorful spectrum of conspiracy theories, because once you get into that territory, I mean, the sky's the limit. But I suppose what's interesting is that you had figures in quite, I mean, again, we can think of examples from today, but you had figures of authority backing some of these theories. So, for example, there was a senior military personality in the United States who was on the record and reported in the newspapers as saying that he wouldn't put it past the Germans to sow this virus on the shores of the United States with their submarines and their U-boats. There were other ideas that it was that school books were being infected with it deliberately by the Germans, that aspirin, which was really the only treatment that they had, the so-called miracle drug, which could actually have a beneficial impact because it was anti-inflammatory, so it could reduce the inflammatory reaction in the lungs if used in the right dose, which it often wasn't. But aspirin, one of the major manufacturers of aspirin at the time was Bayer, the German company. So there were masses of conspiracy theories about it being the packages were being contaminated with the virus, and that's the way it was being transported around the world. There were ideas espoused even by serious scientists and doctors that this was noxious air floating up off the battlefields of Flanders and being dissipated over the world, a kind of resurrection of the idea of miasma from the Middle Ages, bad air that causes disease. So I think, you can see conspiracy theories are a feature of every pandemic. But what I think is interesting is that the content of the conspiracy theories changes by era. And what you see there is that it was very easy for them to tip back to a kind of more mystical, more religious era in the content of their conspiracy theories. Of course, it was strongly colored also by the fact that they were at war and they had obvious enemies to blame.
Right, to move on down the questions, there's one from Andrew and Liz, and I couple it with Swedeka's, which say, when approximately was the last case recorded? What caused the pandemic to stop? And how long did it take for the economy to recover? I think Swedeka's is the same, basically. How long did it take for the pandemic to disappear?
I mean, it's really interesting, and it's sort of a hopeful message. Pandemics always do disappear on their own eventually, even if we do nothing. Even if we do nothing, COVID-19 will eventually recede. And that's because of all sorts of mechanisms by which the virus adapts to us and we adapt to the virus. Every flu strain, seasonal flu strain that circulates now in the world, once started as a much more vicious pandemic strain that was new to humanity and therefore much more vicious. And then through this process of adapting to each other, because it wants to survive and we want to survive, we both kind of gravitate to a more harmonious relationship where it can infect us without too many symptoms or being too visible, causing too much of a reaction, and we can, sort of get on with our lives while living with it. That's the sort of ideal scenario. That's the end point, if you like. And that appears the first part of that process is violent because the virus is virulent and it takes out the most fragile in society. Those it infects who survive develop some immunity. So there's this gradual kind of, adaptation of the two populations to each other. The last cases of 1918, it really, as I said, it depended on where you were in the world, but you saw this kind of, it's very difficult to say when a pandemic starts and when it ends. When it ends is when the seasonal flus or the outbreaks become less and less virulent until we consider them endemic, but that's a sort of arbitrary judgment, really. It's a bell curve like that, and this is the peak, and then maybe there are several peaks if you look at it in detail, but basically it gradually recedes until it becomes something that doesn't disappear, it's there, but it's circulating at a level that we consider endemic rather than epidemic. As far as I know, on the data that I've seen so far, it was longer in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. It was longer, it lingered longer in places like Japan, than in the West. And the Pacific Islands, as far as I know, is the place that had it, where it was really raging for the longest, into July 1921.
Right. And what about the recovery of the economy, which I suppose would be different in different countries, but
well, so I talked about this ability of humanity to bounce back from pandemics more easily than from wars because the infrastructure is not destroyed. So there is an idea that the Roaring Twenties, that the 20s was this kind of first of all, the baby boom, demographic rebound, economic rebound, cultural rebound. It was a time when people were very experimental, both in the sciences and in the arts. So there was this great kind of outpouring of creativity, and that may have been related to the pandemic. Again, in 1918, you always have this problem that you can't separate the war from the pandemic and the effects of the two. But the fact is that throughout history, there has been a rebound from pandemics. This pandemic, COVID-19, where are we? We are beyond 4 million deaths globally, definitely underreported, but not yet at 5 million. It's nowhere near in the league of the Spanish flu in terms of death, especially given that the global population is 4 times what it was today than it was then. So we're not in the same league, but this is still very bad. And so I think we can expect a rebound, a recession and then a rebound. But the rebound will not be on the scale of the Roaring Twenties because the loss wasn't on the scale of the Spanish flu.
Question from Flo, which is to do with memory. It says, if human beings are condemned to forgetting, are we doomed to never being able to deal with the inequalities that all pandemics always highlight? Do you feel more hopeful that after this current pandemic, things might change?
Well, okay, so that's a really good question. And the history of pandemics is that we talk a lot while we're in the pandemic about everything that's going to change and how the world will never be the same again. And then it very quickly goes back to exactly what it was before. But then things do change, but they're not necessarily the things that we predict will change. And I think that's what's so interesting. We're going to see how this plays out. At the same time, there is this thing about this pandemic that is different from all the pandemics of the past, which is that it has been digitally witnessed. We have everything about this pandemic has been logged and recorded, and we've all witnessed it. And we've all had a sense all the way along of how global it was. I mean, just to give you an example, the Spanish flu was the name given to that pandemic essentially by the nations that were victorious in the First World War and therefore the most powerful nations on earth, and therefore could name it as they wished. But in the early stages of the pandemic, it had myriad different names in different places because people didn't realize that it was the same thing everywhere. Everyone thought they had this local disease. They called it different things. People had different expectations of health in different parts of the world, so they have different ideas of what a disease means. That, by the way, is exactly the same today. So there were millions of different names. And it was only over time that people realized it was not many little epidemics, it was one major pandemic. And so this one name came to dominate. But today, from the beginning, we've always known that this was a pandemic. It took us a while to realize that problem in China is coming this way. And, arguably we should have been quicker off the mark. But pretty quickly, we understood that it was the same problem afflicting the whole globe. And we never had more than one name for it, although Mr. Trump tried to give it other names.
Right. Okay, well, let's hope things will change. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? There's a question or comments really from Louise Warren to say, I'm not sure how writers will interpret COVID today. Maybe there will be a distanced approach. Fables and fairy tales. Maybe that is what Fitzgerald was doing. Also about the lack of monuments. Pandemics are invisible. There is no visible enemy. It lacks a victorious narrative. So I don't know if you perhaps agree with those points or wish to.
Well, the fairy tale point is really interesting because actually I've spoken to people who write science fiction and they have always loved pandemics and used pandemics as narrative and storytelling devices. And I think perhaps they are a bit ahead of the curve here. I've heard sort of many mainstream literary writers saying that it's not something they're interested in treating. They just can't wait for it to be over and for life to get back to normal. which I think is, I mean, you know, I would never dream of telling any writer what to write about, but I think it is curious and interesting that this thing, which is such a part of our human experience, as much, if not more than war, is something that artists overlook. And in some ways, generally speaking, they're doing us a disservice, because if we don't remember these and don't learn from them, it's because it's not somehow, we don't have a psychological monument to it in art. So I'm not criticizing anyone. I wouldn't dream of it, but I think it's really interesting that we have this sort of artistic blind spot to this, you know, eternal dimension of human experience. What was the other part of the question? No visible enemy. Well, no, but does the enemy have to be visible for us to understand that it exists? Death is pretty visible. Overflowing hospitals is pretty visible. You know, I think the other thing to say about that is you know, from the Middle Ages, epidemics and pandemics were always considered a sort of act of God, something that we couldn't help, something that just sort of fell upon us, often in punishment for something we'd done. But it was fatalistic. You just had to bear it. You couldn't do anything about it. But I think nowadays that we have kind of different narratives, and we talk about, for example, destruction of the forests, industrial scale farming. We're beginning to understand that actually we have a hand in creating these pandemics. We have a hand in driving the emergence of new infections. We are not guilt-free in this whole story. You know, that we have a greater understanding more and more by the day, I think, that of the globe as a sort of interconnected biological system in which we play our part, and that we need to look at our own role in driving those infections, which are accelerating. You know, the rate of new zoonoses is accelerating in recent decades. So that enemy is something that we have helped create. And therefore, you could say that we are our own enemy, and that enemy has our face on it. So I wonder if, as the narrative changes, that whole story of the invisible enemy will go away as well. There's a question that partly links into that, which I'll come on to in a moment, but a question first from Bernie, who says the successful Australian response was repeated this time around. Why haven't those lessons been learned by other countries? Could you say something about Australia in relation to the Spanish flu, what they did that was different? Yeah, well, this is fascinating. So, and I think it is easier if you're an island to protect yourself from the pandemic, because you can more easily close your borders. And that's what Australia did in 1918. It closed its borders because, as I said, the pandemic was slightly staggered in time. So it came later to the southern hemisphere than the north. And that gave the south, if it was on the lookout, an advantage. And Australia did use that advantage. It looked to the north, it saw this wave of infection coming towards it, and it closed its maritime borders and very strictly before the second wave struck in September, October of 1918. And it kept that lethal second wave out. Unfortunately, it lifted the quarantine too early and let in the third wave in the early months of 1919. How are they to know? Of course, it's easy for me to say in hindsight, they didn't know. And they would have had the usual pressures, the clamoring from businessmen and, you know, commercial sector, open up, open up, open up. So they did open up, and they let in the third wave, and 12,000 Australians died in the early months of 1919. But it would have been much, much worse if they let in, obviously, the second wave. So they did do a good job. They've done a good job this time. But what I think is really interesting about COVID is that the list of countries that have done that good job is growing. You know, initially the narrative was, oh, China's managed it because it's an autocratic regime, but the rest of us couldn't possibly do that because we couldn't possibly, you know, curtail our civil liberties. Well, now Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, many, many countries have achieved it. And in fact, you know, there's a debate going on amongst public health officials, which is why hasn't the WHO why hasn't elimination been put on the table? Why are we talking about trade-offs? Why are we talking about COVID having to be endemic forever? We can still get rid of it. We just have to tighten up our response now, suffer in the short term with targeted support for those suffering in order to free ourselves in the long term. And nobody's even considering that. There's this kind of fatalistic mindset. And actually, I was speaking yesterday to the head of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, John Nkengasong, and he was saying, Africa can't afford to live with COVID. We just can't afford it, a disease of this lethality and this contagiousness. So we have to get rid of this. And he is working on that principle, but what's working against him achieving that is, you know, what we refer to now as vaccine nationalism. The vaccine is his best hope for protecting Africa against COVID. And the fact that the rich countries are stockpiling and hoarding the vaccines is preventing him from achieving that goal. So, you know, talk about the interaction and the tangling of politics and public health. It's eternal.
Have to put more pressure on governments to have a coordinated response, put more money into COVAX and so on. Hopefully, with the greater availability of vaccines, and if some of the vaccine manufacturers are prepared to do what AstraZeneca seems to have done, which is to make it available at cost, which is not the case, I think, of the big American companies, then we might be in a better position. But it's probably going a little bit off the subject. I just want to get back to the questions. And David had asked a question.
5 minutes, Anthony, but I ought to go in 5 minutes. But
yes, I thought we close at 9. Let me just have if that's all right. Well, we'll just take this one, which is any indication that the Spanish flu had an animal origin, and were any specific mutations identified?
Oh yeah, it was definitely an animal origin. All flus come originally, we think, from birds, usually water birds. There is doubt over the Spanish flu as to whether it came directly from a bird to human beings, or whether it passed via an intermediate host, possibly a pig, because pigs share. Basically, the virus has to adapt to receptors on different cell types, which are different in different hosts. And the interesting thing about the pig is that it shares similarities with the receptors on bird cells, lung cells, and other cells, and human cells. So it's a good intermediary where the virus can sort of learn to adapt to the new host. And we can't answer that question for the moment, but it originally came from birds, that's for sure.
Right, well, thank you very much. Well, fortunately, we seem to have reached the end of questions for the moment, just about the right time. So just remains really for me to say thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I mean, there's so much to learn actually from this pandemic. There's much to be learned from your book. I would recommend that people go and get themselves a copy. The Friends have bought a copy, which will be put in Belsize Community Library. So for those of you who are in the vicinity, you will be able to arrange through the mechanism that's been set up at the moment to go and borrow it. But otherwise, do get one and look into all this. I think, as I say, the lessons are enormous. You've drawn attention to a number of them. I mean, take, for example, quarantine, border control, strengthening public health services, and there are a whole lot of others, I think, to do with, you know, messaging and trust and so on and so forth, which, you know, we seem to have to repeat all this every time, and people know what these infections are. You know, we know how infections work. It's really relatively simple, really, and yet it's ignored. You know, had a huge pandemic sort of information exercise, Cygnus, I think, in 2016, which produced a lot of information as to how pandemic, I think we were thinking of flu, but a lot similar might be handled. And as far as I know, a lot of that's still secret. So we've got some way to go, really, in getting this sorted out. Anyway, having said that, I would just like to say to everybody, the next meeting that we have is on the 18th of March. We're going to be addressed by Joshua Levine, who is a barrister turned writer and broadcaster who's written a number of books about the First World War, the Second World War, the Irish Troubles. And because it's a convenient anniversary, we'll be talking about the Blitz and looking at some of the comparisons between 1940 to 41 and 2020 to 21. So do make a note of that. We'll be sending it round to our usual mailing list. And I put a donation link in the chat. So if anybody would like to copy that, put it into your browser, and then you'll have the opportunity at leisure to make a small donation to the library if you feel so inclined. So anyway, thank you. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for your excellent questions. And thank you, Laura, for a very interesting talk and excellent answers. And we're able to let you go by 9. I realize it's 10 o'clock in Paris. So thank you for bearing with us. Thank you very
My
much. Okay.
Great talking to
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you very much. Bye.